Hello humans, welcome back to my world of stuff. It is I, Paul Mount. Beautiful, gorgeous Thursday morning here in, as you can see, sunny South Wales. I'm off to the cinema. Yeah, I got a baseball cap on. So sue me. Yeah, I'm off to the cinema. I'm taking you with me. Wait a minute though. Didn't I say in a video posted just this week that I wouldn't be doing cinema vlogs because people don't watch them? Well, it's true, but I am nothing if not a mass of contradictions in vaguely human form. But today's film is one I can't resist vlogging about because it's the much-awaited 28 years later. I'm not going to call it the third in the trilogy. We had the original 28 Days Later back in 2002, and then 28 weeks later, a few years later, and it's been a long old wait for this latest film, which has only come about because the great Danny Boyle and Alex Garland came up with an idea for doing another film. Oh my god, I've just got in the car. It's like an oven in here. Summer's arrived, so I'll take off my baseball cap. So yes, it's the latest 28 Days franchise film, I suppose. First in the new trilogy. I can't wait to see it. It's probably my most anticipated film of the year. You're going to get Fantastic Four and Superman and even the Jurassic Dinosaurs. This is the one for me. Bit of post-apocalyptic chaos, and for that reason alone, because I've been awaiting it for so long and I love this sort of film, I'm going to do a one-off vlog, not a long review, just going to go and see the film, grab a bit of food on the way and talk about the film when I come out. So I'll see you lot after this lot. So here we are back in the cinema room a few hours later, having seen 28 years later. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk for too long about the film, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. I will refer to it in my Films of the Month roundup at the end of the month. As I mentioned, I will be doing that, just talking about films I've watched during the month, whether they're on streaming, physical media, TV, whatever. I just want to round them up and talk about them at the end of the month, which I think is something a lot of people do these days. But I wanted to talk about this film because, as I said in the breathless preamble, don't worry, I wasn't gasping for breath, it's just very hot today. It's a film I've been really looking forward to since I heard that it was being made, because I was a huge fan of Danny Boyle's original film. Of course, it was Danny Boyle directed the original film and Alex Garland provided the script for 2002's 28 Days Later. I think it was one of the projects that kick-started that resurgence of interest in the undead and zombies in the early 21st century. Things like The Walking Dead, Dead Set, umpteen straight-to-DVD or straight-to-video horror films that have plundered this idea, and they're still being made now. I watched one called The Silent Zone fairly recently. Ironically, of course, 28 Days Later itself wasn't really a zombie film in that sense. It wasn't about people dying and coming back to life. It was about people becoming infected by a rage virus that turned them into zombies, I suppose. But it was that one film that really kicked it all off, I think, in a way, and everybody suddenly jumped on this bandwagon and made films and TV shows that were actually more successful than 28 Days Later, which itself, while successful and profitable, was never a major box office hit, but it did well enough to earn a sequel a few years later, which wasn't directed by Danny Boyle and wasn't written by Alex Garland. 28 years later, however, I would say is the spiritual successor and the proper successor to that first film. Now, I like 28 Weeks Later. I think it's a great action horror film, but it doesn't have that sense of urgency and sense of gritty reality that 28 Days Later had. 28 years later, and I'm going to get my days, weeks and years tangled up in this review, but this film really goes back to that aesthetic of the first film, that gritty, grounded look. It's been widely reported that the film was made on iPhones. Now that, of course, conjures up images of people holding up iPhones. It's a bit more complicated than that, of course. It's very sophisticated iPhones mounted on very sophisticated camera rigs, almost like proper film cameras, but basically iPhone quality. And you can see it in places. It has that very real look to it. It's hasn't got the grain that 28 Days Later had, but it's very much a film made in that style. You put those two films together, you can see that they're very closely connected. This is a great film. I haven't mentioned that yet, but this is a terrific film, and it more than satisfied my expectations in different ways, actually. It wasn't exactly what I expected, but it was better than I expected. I wasn't expecting a traditional sort of zombie undead horror film from these two, because 28 Days Later showed that that wasn't what they wanted to do. And I suspect that this film actually came about because of two things that have happened in British culture fairly recently. One of them in world culture. The pandemic, which created this sense of isolation and sense of quarantine. And Brexit, because the themes of isolation encompass that post-Brexit feeling of the UK cut off from Europe, cut off from support of Europe, and to an extent being left to fend for itself. And I think those are the two themes that kicked off this idea for a new entry into the series. Again, as I mentioned in the introduction before the credits, I don't really feel this is the third in the franchise, because I don't regard this as a franchise. It was a successful film that spawned a sequel, and now many years later we've got a third film. So it is a third film, but as we know, it's the first of a new trilogy of films. The second film, The Bone Temple, is out in January. Third film isn't in production yet. I understand that it's still awaiting funding. I suspect when the box office numbers for this come in this week, the funding will be put in place fairly quickly, and we'll get the third film 18 months or so down the line. This is set 28 years later in an isolated island community off the coast of Scotland. It's a sort of holy island. And there's a sort of a community which is built up there, a community of survivors. The film actually starts with a sequence set back at the beginning of the infection. And it's quite chilling because it's a group of children. You may have seen a clip of it in the trailer. A group of children, terrified, watching Teletubbies on television. The mother comes in, bundles another child into the group. It's obvious that something horrible is happening. You can hear sort of screeching, roaring sounds. Then one of the kids goes to the door and the infected smash their way in, and the inevitable happens. Mercifully, we don't see the inevitable, but we see blood splattering across the screen. We know that something very nasty has happened indeed. One young lad escapes from the carnage. He runs to the nearby church where the vicar, who I think is supposed to be his father, he sort of welcomes the coming of the end of days and the scenes of the infected crashing through stained glass windows. And before he is subsumed by the infected, the vicar gives the young boy his crucifix. The boy then hides somewhere in the church as these creatures rampage through and destroy everything in their wake. 28 years later, we are informed by captions on the screen that the UK has been isolated and quarantined. The virus was kept at bay from Europe. You may recall from 28 weeks later, it ended with scenes of the infected rushing into the Channel Tunnel and heading up towards Paris. It appears that the infection and the infected were fought back. The UK is now completely alone and completely isolated, and any and all survivors are left to fend for themselves. That's where we are when we meet the community on the Holy Island. The main group of characters we meet here are played by Aaron Taylor-Johnson, Jodie Comer, and a terrific young actor called Alfie Williams. Alfie Williams is the star of this film. There's no doubt about it. He's a kid in his early teens who has to play a 12-year-old boy. And as a rite of passage, his father, played by Aaron Taylor-Johnson, takes him off the island onto the mainland via this causeway that connects the mainland to the island. The tides rise or fall at certain times of the day, and it's either passable or it's impassable. Once they're on the mainland, it is, as I said, a rite of passage, coming of age type thing. He takes him to the island and shows him how to hunt the infected, shows him how to stay alive in this barren, desolate, wild environment, which is just full of the infected, who have evolved and devolved since the earlier films. They've evolved to the extent that there are now creatures who are called alphas, and they have a semblance of intelligence and thinking capability. They're also extremely powerful. They, in several scenes, grab their victims by the head and pull their heads off and pull out their spines. Yum yum. They're also fairly impervious to weapons if they're hit by bows and arrows, which are the weapons that the characters have to use, they shrug off the injuries, whereas the normal undead, they get an arrow through the head or through the heart and they're down. They've also devolved into these horrible, grotesque, bulbous creatures that crawl across the ground, grubbing around for worms and insects, and they are disgusting looking creatures, to be honest, and they also succumb fairly easily to the bows and arrows. It's an untenable situation though. The pair get into increasing difficulty and make their way back to the island. Spike, the young boy, he feels that he's failed because he hasn't been able to step up to the mark. He hasn't been able to do the thing that the mission was all about, turning him into a man, a fighting machine. He's not been able to kill to the extent that he needed to in the situations that arise. Meanwhile, his mother, Isla, played by Jodie Comer, she's ill. She's feverish. She's in bed. She's drifts in and out of awareness. She doesn't seem to know exactly where she is, what's happening. She has these moments of lucidity. Spike has discovered that there's a Dr. Elson on the mainland, played by Ralph Fiennes. Dr. Elson, he's assured, went mad many years ago, and he sets up funeral pyres. He's told about an experience when Dr. Kelson was seen gathering up hundreds of bodies and burning them, and then creating this huge towering structure out of their skulls. However, Spike realises that if this man is a doctor, he may be somebody who can help his ailing mother, Isla. He takes her off the island, back onto the mainland. The pair encounter several perils and several dangers. They meet up with a survivor of a Swedish armed patrol group that's been patrolling the North Sea, which has found itself on the mainland. There's only one survivor of that group. His name is Eric. And eventually they do meet up with Dr. Kelson, who makes a certain diagnosis about Isla. This is a very strong, very powerful film. It isn't just a horror film. It's full of viscera and bloodletting and extreme grotesque imagery. But it tells a story about a young boy coming to terms with the world he finds himself in, assuming responsibility. I suppose it is, and I hate the expression coming of age, but it is a coming of age type film because this boy has to grasp the metal and do the thing that his father, who he discovers isn't quite the hero he thought he was. He has to take over and do the right thing for his mother. The first hour is really gripping, really intense, really immersive. You feel for these characters. I mean, Garland's script really paints these characters well. You feel you know them. When they hit the mainland, this is where we discover that things are really appalling, and they are genuinely appalling. And there's a real sense of the apocalyptic in the way it's filmed, the cinematography. A couple of scenes that show remnants of society. There's an action sequence that takes place around an old Happy Eater restaurant that's fallen into decay, an abandoned train that's crashed under a bridge where a certain important part of the plot takes place. You get that gritty sense of the UK having collapsed in on itself. I think if I have any criticism about the setup, I think it's probably unlikely that in a real situation such as this, that the UK will be just abandoned and locked up and quarantined. Yes, this is a terrible disease, but I don't believe that Britain would just be left to rot. I think there would be attempts made to rescue survivors, and particularly where the survivors are on this island, not inaccessible, they could have been rescued. So I think that perhaps the background doesn't completely chime with reality. But of course, we are in a situation here where the unthinkable has happened and the country has been brought to its knees by this terrible disease that's turned people into monsters. As you can see, we have a little visitor who's decided to make herself known. I won't say a lot more about the film because I would compel you to go and see it, but it is very gritty and very grounded. As I said, the first hour is extremely powerful stuff from a character point of view. And it gets even more gripping and even more disturbing and sort of tragic. So it's a mixture of this boy finding his feet and becoming a man, even though he's only 12. The situation regarding his mother and regarding his father, and how he has to step up and take over to do the right thing for his mother. Some of the reviews I've read have pointed out that the last half an hour perhaps isn't quite as gripping. I think the point there is that it's focusing more on Spike and his situation here on the mainland. And there are action sequences which are studied throughout the film because it needs them to create that sense of horror. But the last half an hour isn't necessarily about that. It is about the end of a journey and what happens at the end of that journey. What it very much isn't, though, is a shoot-'em-up zombie film. It's not that sort of film. There are incidents that involve the undead. There's lots of blood and splatter and all that sort of stuff. It's not a film about the infected any more than, say, The Walking Dead. is about the zombies, the undead, the walkers, because they're the background. And they're the background to this story about people surviving in this particular unit, dysfunctional family unit, I suppose, where the young boy has to take charge because of the father's failing. But if you're expecting balls to the wall action and non-stop, machine gunning of the infected and explosions, it's much more intimate than that. And that's why it's such a good film. It works in the genre, but it doesn't play to the expectations of the genre because it's more subtle than that. It is about what happens 28 years after this has all happened in the UK, after the UK has been destroyed, and how a small group of people are just trying to survive from day to day. I thought this was a fantastic film, and I'm aware that some people have been a bit puzzled about the last few minutes when you think the film has come to a natural end, but then a new facet is introduced, which is there to set up this sequel, The Bone Temple, which is out in January. So without going too deeply into spoilers, I thought this was a very powerful experience that's not without a couple of moments of humour. It's a very strong, very powerful film that is, as I said, it's very much of a piece with the first one rather than the more cinematic and straightforward down the line adventure of 28 weeks later. This is the second part of that first film. And I think when you realise that Danny Boyle was, 66 when he made this film, but it has the verve and power and energy of a much younger man. And you really can't go wrong. Alex Garland is on a roll at the moment with the stuff that he's doing. I mean, just the last year we've had Civil War, his own film. We had Warfare, which came out fairly recently, which I haven't seen yet. And then this, which puts him back into the franchise that made his name, I suppose. I'm fascinated to see where the next film will take us. Absolutely terrific film, highly recommended. It's not for the faint of heart. And there are some people who might find, because it hasn't got that Hollywood gloss, might find it difficult to come to terms with. This is well budgeted, 60 million, but it isn't a big Hollywood spectacular. It's very, very British film, very British, and all the better for it. So I would advise you to rush down and see it as soon as you can. But it is hard viewing in places. It's uncompromising. It doesn't take the easy route. There's very little optimism or sense of hope. And I must admit, I like that in this sort of film. So that's in cinemas now. Hugely recommended by me. I'm going to give it a big chunky 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 for 28 years later. It's in cinemas now. Head down and see it as soon as you can. And if you do, let me know what you thought of it. Leave a comment down below. Also, like and subscribe to the channel if you can. That would be marvellous. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.